Thank you so very much. I would like to begin by welcoming everybody who's here on the live webinar, whether you're watching at this program live with us at this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar series, or whether you are listening to our podcast or watching the podcast or watching the postcast or watching this on JBS. We very much appreciate your time and your attention. We also want to begin, as ever we do, by expressing our profound thanks to Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for all that you do. And I think Rosita might be making a cameo appearance in this show because we're actually recording from her studio today. So everybody will get an opportunity to see her when she comes in. But thank you so very much, Rosita, for all that you do. And I also want to thank our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, thank you very much for coordinating this. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I begin this conversation, which will last for anywhere between 60 and 75 minutes from the point of commencement, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our guest to you. His name is Amir Tibon. Amir Tibon is an Israeli journalist who works with Haaretz newspaper. From 2017 to 2020, he was the Washington, D.C. correspondent for Haaretz, covering the Trump administration, Congress, and the United States Jewish community. During that period of time, he also covered the far-right march in Charlottesville, Virginia, the anti-Semitic attack on the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the 2020 presidential election. Between 2013 and 2016, Amir was the diplomatic correspondent for Walla News, a leading Israeli news website. And prior to that, he was a producer for Uvda, the leading investigative news program on Israeli television. He's the co-author of The Last Palestinian, a biography of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, which was published in 2017. In 2015, he was nominated for a National Magazine Award in the reporting category for an article on the latest round of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. And for the same article, Amir received an award from the National Press Club for excellence in diplomatic reporting. His writings on Israel and the Middle East have appeared in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Politico magazine, The New Yorker, Tablet magazine, The New Republic, The Huffington Post, The American Interest, and The Jerusalem Report. And he has been interviewed on CNN, Al Jazeera, CBS, and MSNBC. A report produced by Amir and filmed inside Syria in 2012 focused on the country's civil war, and it was chosen by the Israeli Documentary Forum as the best TV segment of the year. Amir lives in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, which, ladies and gentlemen, is the closest place in Israel to the Gaza Strip, and he lives there with his wife and his daughter. He is regularly invited to speak on Israeli politics and the US-Israel relationship, as well as on the subject of life on the Gaza border, in front of various audiences in the United States of America. And above all else, I'm very, very proud to consider Amir as a dear, dear personal friend. Amir, it's wonderful to have you back on here. It's wonderful that you are joining us from Nachal Oz. I believe that's the case. The title of this webinar is Will Bibi Netanyahu or Benjamin Netanyahu return as Prime Minister? Before we get into all of that, tell us about how life is over there in Israel for you. How was your return, your relocation back home, your reconstitution, if you like, back home after your time as the White House correspondent? How are you enjoying things, and what's day-to-day life like?
Well, Benjamin, it's pretty weird here today. Did you ever imagine that the biggest story on the news in Israel for 2 days in a row would be about ice cream? Because I certainly didn't, but then Ben and Jerry's happened. So these are a bit interesting times. You know, Benjamin, about 5 years ago in the summer, we were talking. It was a short time after you actually attended my wedding, MirYam and my wedding here in Nachal Oz. We were debating, you know, what I should do next. I had this offer from Haaretz to go to Washington, D.C. to cover the emerging Trump presidency. And I was deliberating because we loved our life here in the kibbutz, even though this is a complicated place, right on the border with Gaza, not always easy. And eventually, after talking to you and other friends, I decided to go for it. And we had 4 wonderful years in Washington, D.C. We actually lived in Virginia, in Alexandria, beautiful town. But after the end of the Trump presidency, it was the right time for us to return home. We had Galia, our daughter, born in Virginia, and we wanted her to be close to the grandparents. She's the first grandchild on both sides, my side and Miri's side. And it was very clear that her place is here in Israel, and specifically here in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, our home. So it's great to join you from here. And I shifted professionally to a different role in the newspaper, editorial role, a managerial role, which is also a very interesting experience for me. And I'm very, very happy again to talk with you again and to have these interesting and deep conversations that we've been having for years, really, about the Israeli politics and the US-Israel relationship and Israel and American Jewry. So it's great to see you, my friend, and I'm looking forward to your tough questions.
Thank you. And just before I do come to that, tell me, do you miss at all being on the beat, so to speak, now that you're in a more editorial position?
Some days I do, and then other days I just enjoy what I'm doing so much, and I tend to look forward, not to get too much into nostalgia. But listen, the Trump years were a fascinating time to be in Washington, D.C. Unprecedented on so many levels, whether it's the general madness and craziness that was happening, whether it is a very interesting and unique events that took place in the context of the US-Israel relationship, the moving of the embassy, the Abraham Accords, and whether it's this explosion that we saw of anti-Semitism in the United States coming from many different directions. You mentioned I was in Pittsburgh and I was in Charlottesville, and there were other tragic events, in New Jersey and other places. So there was so much to write about and so much that was relevant to the readers back home in Israel. But luckily, in the newspaper business in Israel, you're always going to have stuff to write about. It's never boring. There's always news stories to tell, and that's what we try to do.
Well, Amir, let's turn to the subject at hand. I want to set the scene, though, if I may. I would like everybody to be aware of the following about me, which is that whenever I've been on the ground in Israel for any election since 2014, and I've frankly lost count of how many elections there were, some of which I was home for, others of which I was not home for, I've actually protest voted against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, that may surprise some people, but to give you the full picture, I have protest voted against him by casting my vote in favor of candidates to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu, to the right politically of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, you, on the other hand, are someone who I believe, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, will have voted for candidates other than Benjamin Netanyahu, but I suspect, whether in protest or not, I suspect you will have done so for candidates to his left.
You are correct. Yes.
Right. And I wanted everybody to understand the different perspectives that we come to, which is that neither of us on this call has been particularly satisfied with his leadership over the course of the recent years. But whatever the case may be, I think, Amir, we can both acknowledge that Benjamin Netanyahu is at the very least a generational politician. Politicians like him simply do not emerge each time there is an election cycle, certainly not with the frequency of those in Israel. And so to get us going, Amir, I'd like you in a positive sense to tell us about some of Bibi's key accomplishments as Prime Minister that demonstrate the generational nature of his leadership.
Well, first of all, Benjamin, the important thing to remember is that he first got elected in 1996 when I was in elementary school. And then, he had a short term as Prime Minister, 2.5 years, and that ended with an election loss in 1999. And then a period of 10 years in some form of political desert, although he did have a short, but in my opinion, a very influential term as Israeli finance minister under Ariel Sharon during the Second Intifada, when he took some very unpopular steps regarding the Israeli economy, slashing all kinds of governmental budgets. One very particular point was budgets that went to families with many children. The government was under the influence of the ultra-Orthodox parties, basically giving very large handouts to families that had 5, 6, 7 children, most of it in the ultra-Orthodox society and the Arab society. And he decided to cut those budgets. An interesting fact that people a lot of times are surprised to learn is that the Israeli media outlet that was most supportive of those reforms and gave him very strong backing in its editorial line was Haaretz. And he actually, Netanyahu, his finance minister, sent a letter, some kind of an inscription to the owner of Haaretz, Amos Shoken. You know, the Shoken family has owned the Haaretz for many decades, thanking him for the newspaper's editorial line and the understanding that it showed towards his unpopular but necessary economic steps. So that's just kind of like an interesting factoid about Netanyahu and Haaretz. There are many more to tell. We'll get to them maybe later. Came back to be prime minister in 2009 after that decade in the desert, and held on to power for 12 straight years, more than basically bypassing David Ben-Gurion as the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel, presiding over a period that for most of the years was relatively quiet in the security, terrorism, wars front. No wars with any other country, several rounds of war with Hamas in Gaza. And we can debate, Benjamin, whether that is an achievement or a failure, because there are very different perspectives on this question on the fact that during his time, we did not have any kind of big confrontation militarily with Hezbollah or with Iran, and even the wars with Hamas usually ended inconclusively. Some people actually consider that a great achievement. They say he presided over a period of quiet with relatively less casualties on the Israeli side. Others say this to the quiet needed to be addressed regarding Hamas, regarding Hezbollah, regarding Iran, and that because there were no big confrontations, they grew and grew and amassed more weapons and capabilities. So this is an interesting question of how do you look at this. I think the key issue that he raised on the international agenda was the Iranian issue. And again, you can look at this from different perspectives in terms of achievement or failure. On the one hand, he got President Trump to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, which I think was a huge diplomatic achievement in terms of Israeli influence in the United States. I mean, it's pretty clear that among other factors that guided this decision by President Trump, there was a very strong influence for his relationship with Netanyahu and for Netanyahu's advocacy against that nuclear agreement. On the other hand, if we look to sum up his 12 straight years in office, during that period, Iran's capabilities grew stronger and bolder and more threatening towards Israel. So again, it depends. If you want to say his greatest achievement is making more people, including at some point an American president, aware of the Iranian danger, and you can look at it from the other side and say, at the bottom line, if you look at the numbers game, Iran has stockpiled more, built more, reached longer terms with its missiles, expanded its influence. And again, you know, different perspectives on this question. On the Palestinian issue, I think the most important development of the Netanyahu years is the slow decline of the Palestinian issue as a major issue in the international arena. This was an issue that 20 years ago, you had a Republican administration in the United States, the George W. Bush administration, adopting on it the view of linkage, basically saying, in order to reach peace and quiet in Iraq and a broader peace in the Middle East, you need to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is the major issue that is standing in the way of a better Middle East. Today, nobody thinks that way. I, as an Israeli, believe that it's in our interest to reach some kind of, if not a solution, then at least a better reality with the Palestinians. I believe it's an urgent matter. You and I, Benjamin, can argue about this for hours, how to do it, but it's certainly not a key issue on the international agenda anymore. It's barely mentioned in the most important speeches that you will see in the UN General Assembly. Arab countries have signed normalization agreements with Israel while not waiting for the Palestinians to solve their own problems with the Israeli side. We've had wars with Hamas in Gaza, during which the streets in the Arab world, maybe except for Jordan, were mostly quiet. And again, some people will say this is actually Netanyahu's greatest achievements. Of course, others will criticize him and say we should have used this new international setting that he had a very big stake in creating to reach concrete changes on the ground that would improve our standing, and that did not really happen. The whole situation has frozen. And if we want to come back to the Ben and Jerry's example, it was deep in the freezer until suddenly some ice cream company came and brought it back to the news agenda. And the last thing I want to say, and this is where I believe, in all the previous examples I gave, you could see an achievement or a failure, something to praise him or something to criticize him. The one issue where I personally, and this is obviously an opinion, but it's not just my opinion, it's an opinion shared by many, many Israelis. I think the one area where I give him an F, not an A, not a B plus, not a C, not debatable, but an F, is the issue of the internal strife within Israeli society. And I believe this is at the end of the day, the issue that brought him down. The divisions within our society between religious and secular, left wing and right wing, Jews and Arab citizens of Israel, ultra-Orthodox and other groups, all of that became toxic in recent years. And we reached really terrible places in the discourse in this country, in the political and social discourse. And he as prime minister was not able, and some would say maybe did not want to, bring us to a better place on that front. And I think at the end of the day, this specific failure is the one that brought him down. Whereas on the other issues, you can see great achievements, you can criticize, but on this issue, I think was the main weakness compared to the other arenas where you can also see some very positive examples.
So you've mentioned a lot there, and I actually agree with much of what you've said. I felt that the management of the Israel-Palestinian conflict was all for naught when he had an opportunity to stand up and to promote an alternative to the hackneyed two-state solution formula. I think he could have done that with President Trump in the White House, and he didn't do that. I think that he had room to...
You were pushing for it at the time.
Very much so. We were very involved with that, and you and I had conversations behind the scenes about all of that over a sustained period of time. It was there for the taking. It ultimately is not something that was taken up. And I think that's regrettable. If one has room to maneuver, one should not luxuriate in that space. One should actually move the ball down the field to their advantage. And I think that was a failure in the Israel-Palestinian arena. Sorry, Amir, it looks like you wanted to come back on something.
Well, to offer some defense of the opposition leader and former prime minister, I think his view of this issue was always more conservative than right-wing, right? There is a distinction between right-wing and conservative, even though a lot of times in the discourse, they are merged into one. Because you can be a right-wing a politician or a activist or thinker and promote revolutionary new ideas. Whereas if you come and look at something from a conservative perspective, your main objective is to kind of stop the progress of history. Mm-hmm. And I think on the Palestinian issue, Netanyahu was always more of a conservative than a pure right-winger. And some of his supporters never understood it. And of course, from the left, that was also a criticism. Maybe we had ideal conditions to make progress diplomatically. But the conservative view that you need to kind of freeze the conflict in place, I think is what stopped him from adopting new ideas during the Trump years, like what you were promoting.
I agree. I think a manager, not an initiator, is how I would put it. Just managing various topics. And now you've made a mention of a number of areas where he was a success, where it's debatable as to whether or not he was a success, and where you said he absolutely was not successful, and you gave him the F grade for failing to improve the internal strife within the state of Israel. Now, those are all policy issues. I also want to talk about his politicking, if I may, because he does have a constituency. There's that old phrase that a leader without a following is just a guy taking a walk. Benjamin Netanyahu certainly has a following. He's not just an individual taking a walk. And yet he was unable to cobble together a coalition, despite at the end throwing out some real Hail Mary offers to various potential coalition partners. What about his politics prevented him from putting a coalition together, Amir?
This is an issue that smarter men and women than me have offered great words of wisdom on. I can only try to kind of coalesce some kind of an explanation based on all of these wonderful articles and analysis pieces, and a bit from my own experience, because I have had over the years several interesting interactions with the man and with some of his political rivals who then brought him down. I think what really happened is that Netanyahu was a very successful politician ever since his comeback in 2009. He learned the lessons of his failure in the 1990s the hard way. He lost power after 2.5 years, and as I said, was in kind of a political desert for a decade. And we have to remember, Benjamin, in 2006, he led Likud to its worst result in history, 12 seats. Likud, in the glory days of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, and even under Ariel Sharon, was very close to 40 seats, and sometimes even surpassed 40 seats. And for that party to reach 12 under Netanyahu's leadership in 2006 was a low point. But he came back from that, and he led it back to the high 20s area, and at some point even in the 30s. And I think what happened is that after a very successful decade politically for him, from 2009 until 2019, a lot of people that he stepped on the way up, and a lot of people that he brought down within his own party and within his own orbit decided to join forces and take him down to some degree in an act of revenge. Because if you look at the people who are the members of this current Israeli government that replaced Netanyahu, so you have one party, actually two, that were never in coalition with Netanyahu. Meretz, which is the most left-wing element in the government, and Ra'am, the Islamist party that Netanyahu had a long affair with, but so overall, the overall makeup of this government, if you put aside Meretz and the Islamists who have never sat with Netanyahu in coalition, it's basically a bunch of parties that sat with Netanyahu for years. The Labour Party sat with Netanyahu under the leadership of Ehud Barak and almost joined again and again under other leaders. Yair Lapid was finance minister under Netanyahu. Bennett basically grew up in Netanyahu's office. He was his personal aide when he was leader of the opposition. Avigdor Lieberman goes with Netanyahu 3 decades back. He was his most trusted man. They ran together in an election. Gideon Sa'ar is a Likudnik. He grew up in Likud under Netanyahu. Netanyahu appointed him to his first ministerial positions. Benny Gantz, the latest example, signed an agreement with Netanyahu just 1.5 years ago that was supposed to divide power between the two of them for a period of 3 stable years. All of these people, I think they are objectively right, but regardless of my view of it, all of them believe deep in their hearts that they have been betrayed by Netanyahu. And so his style of politics, which was ruthless and was very successful for a long time, led to this accumulation of hurt feelings and a sense of betrayal from a lot of people. And at some point they said, okay, let's put aside our own disagreements and join forces to get rid of him. And they all had these histories with him. And I think Gantz was really the straw that broke the camel's back. Because what happened between Netanyahu and Gantz is basically that Gantz decided to break apart his own part. What?
Benny Gantz, who's now the defense minister.
Now the defense minister, and was also in the last Netanyahu government. He decided in 2020, 1.5 years ago, to break apart his own party, to betray his political partners, to lose most of his popular support, and to do all of that in order to sign an agreement with Netanyahu and give Israel a functioning government in the most dangerous, let's say, moment of the COVID-19 crisis. When COVID was a new thing, nobody knew anything about it. The numbers were exploding. Everybody was scared that it's the end of the world. And Gantz, who is a former, a general in the military, and by the way, was appointed by Netanyahu to be the chief of staff of the military. So there is even more of a history there. He said, this is the moment to rise above personal considerations. And he went into government with Netanyahu. And when Netanyahu began to slowly chip at their agreement and break it here and break it there, people said, nobody will believe him again. Because to basically cheat a guy like Gantz, who has this image in Israel, whether it's correct or not, we can have a session on Benny Gantz one day if you want, Benjamin.
That.
Is he really the good guy, the naive guy that everybody thinks he is? But this is his public perception in Israel, the good soldier, okay? And when Netanyahu broke the agreement with him, I think that was the moment when people said, okay, he's not going to be trusted anymore. And that led to the failure to form a coalition. Basically, a loss of trust of too many other party leaders. And so his success, in a sense, was also the root of his eventual failure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you spoke about vengeance as perhaps being a motive of those who'd worked with Netanyahu in years past. I think there's a hint of vengeance about the way in which he's going about his role as leader of the opposition. And one of the things now, to turn to the chances of him making a comeback and again becoming prime minister, we've dealt with some of the events that led up to his demise. Now let's talk about his potential return. You know, much will turn on how effectively he wields the powers that are at his disposal as the leader of opposition. And he has made it very, very clear, whether directly or by one of his proxies, that as leader of the opposition, the governing coalition will be opposed tooth and nail, impeded anywhere and everywhere as they seek to pass legislation in the Knesset. Now, for our listeners, a recent example of that is the family reunification law. For those who are not aware of it, that's a law that blocks the automatic granting of Israeli citizenship or residency to Palestinians on the basis of a marriage to an Israeli citizen. It's a law that's been on the books since 2003 and would be extended each year by a year. But during a recent vote, a compromised position of the government of Naftali Bennett sought to extend the law by 6 months. That was stalemated by Netanyahu and other members of the opposition, despite Netanyahu's ostensible support for that law in principle. And when he was pressed on why he had opposed a law that he had previously supported, Netanyahu told Naftali Bennett in the Knesset plenum, Amir, which basically means you made your bed, now lie in it or lay in it. In essence, Amir, Netanyahu was saying that even on matters of principle, Naftali Bennett's government should not rely on any notion that a Netanyahu opposition will come to their salvation. Now tell us, through coalition math and coalition ideology, why is Bibi likely to prove a troublesome opponent in the way that the opponents to him when he was ruling did not manage to prove themselves as such? Opposition in the past to Netanyahu has been less than potent, to put it mildly. What makes you think Netanyahu will be a potent leader of the opposition now?
Okay. I want to say, first of all, on the family reunification law that you mentioned, one of the issues here was that you could see the dividing lines both within the opposition and the coalition. We have a very strange makeup of both the opposition and the coalition right now, because the coalition has, Meretz and the Islamists on the left, all the way to Bennett's party and Gideon Saar and Lieberman on the right, and then kind of like, Gantz, Lapid, in the center, Labor a bit to the left there. But then in the opposition, you have Likud and the ultra-Orthodox and the far right, but you also have the joint list, which is the most left-wing, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist in some factions, a part of the Israeli political map, and they coordinated in this vote. What happened in this vote is quite amazing. Bennett managed to convince Meretz to vote in favor of this law because it's a coalition necessity, and they got some compromise there, but Meretz would have never voted for that compromise if it was in the opposition. Never, ever. And they got a ton of, beating from their own voters. And even two of the Islamist members of Knesset who are in Bennett's coalition voted in favor of this compromise. But Likud and the religious parties, together with the joint list, voted against it and brought it down. So what does it say? Vegar ze'ev im keves, right? The lamb and the sheep will dwell together. This is what we're seeing. I think what you can learn from it is that Netanyahu really is going to be a ruthless opposition leader, as he should be, by the way, in my opinion. You're the leader of the opposition. You are fighting against the government. This is politics. And he's going to work with the joint list if he needs to. And he will look for defectors inside the government if he needs to. But in a way, Benjamin, there is a bit of a catch-22 here. I believe that the stability of this weird, eclectic Israeli government relies on one man, Benjamin Netanyahu. What holds together the pieces of this government, from Meretz to Bennett, is the fear of a comeback from Netanyahu. I believe that if Netanyahu will withdraw from public life, leave politics, maybe go and do a lecture tour in America or something, this government would fall apart, or maybe just change its composition entirely within a matter of weeks. You would have new leadership for Likud. That leadership would not have the bad blood and history that Netanyahu has with other parties. Um, the whole political dynamic will move from Netanyahu, yes or no, and the debates over the rule of law and democracy, to the more, let's say, regular Israeli political dividing lines, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, settlements, etc., and you would have a different composition. As long as he is the leader of the opposition and he's on television every day and he speaks in the Knesset all the time and everybody is reminded of his a dream of getting back to power, the coalition will stick together because he is the glue. He is the glue that made this coalition possible to begin with. I think one thing that we need to realize when we talk about the internal strife in Israel, when we talk about the disagreements, is that 5 or 6 years ago, the idea that Meretz and the Labour Party would agree to serve under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was just unimaginable to the voters of those two parties. Most of the Labour Party voters, now a bit of a different Labour Party, but still, if you had asked most of the Labour Party voters 5 or 6 years ago, who do you prefer as prime minister if there's only two options, Bennett or Netanyahu? I think you would have either a small advantage for Netanyahu or a tie. Today, it was obvious that Labour and Meretz would serve under Bennett just to get rid of Netanyahu because of the level of toxicity and hatred in the debate and the internal strife that has ballooned under him. And so at the same time that I believe he will be a very effective opposition leader that will really make the lives of the coalition miserable and attack them from here and there and surprise them and embarrass them, at the same time, he will make them hold their hands tight and say, we have to stick together because if this government falls, he will come back. And that's the thing they are most afraid of. So that's the catch-22.
So you've spoken about what binds the coalition, namely the prospect of return of Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me put out there an idea that might fell the coalition because of the disparate components that are within it. You have Meretz, which again, for those on this call or watching or listening, are of the left, and you have Naftali Bennett, decidedly of the right, headed a party that was called Yamina, yes, denoting its rightist attitudes. The reality is that a coalition such as that is unlikely to be able to survive a conflict or a war, Amir. If a conflict or a war comes about, would that be the opportunity for Netanyahu, who we've both said is not actually, in our estimations, for what our estimations are worth, is not actually a success story as Mr. Security for the state of Israel, or it's certainly debatable. I don't believe him to have been successful in ensuring Israel's security. But could that be the opening for Netanyahu to come back as PM?
So first of all, Benjamin, I agree that for Netanyahu, the most reasonable route to this government falling down is through some kind of catastrophe, which I hope will not happen, not just because I personally as a citizen prefer this government over the alternative, but just because even when Netanyahu was prime minister, I never wanted the government to have a catastrophe in order to change the government. And I think any patriotic citizen should avoid that kind of thought. I will say that the mechanism of replacing a government in the Israeli Knesset is much more complicated than people realize. And, Benjamin, in the last 2 years before this government was formed, Netanyahu failed to win a majority for his Likud religious bloc in 4 consecutive elections. And yet it took 2 years to replace him. This gives you an idea not only of what a talented politician he is, which is true, but also of how complicated it is to replace a sitting government in Israel. Because the current mechanism is, it's not enough to have a majority that will vote against the government in a non-confidence vote in the Knesset. In the past, all you needed in order to bring down the government and initiate an election was to have a majority in a non-confidence vote. But during the Netanyahu years, this is a very interesting point, Netanyahu himself pushed to change the law. And he changed it in a manner that in order to bring down the government in a non-confidence vote, you need a majority not only to vote that he doesn't have confidence in the government, but also to vote in favor of an alternative prime minister. If you have tomorrow a majority in the Knesset that votes against this government, non-confidence, but that majority cannot agree on a prime minister, the vote is almost meaningless. It's a political embarrassment for the government, etc., but it will not lead to the fall of Naftali Bennett. Now, Netanyahu, for 2 years, failed to have a majority that will allow him to build a coalition. So it's not very likely that he will now find that majority within the existing makeup of this Knesset. If he had that majority, he would have formed a government and we wouldn't even be in this conversation. So it's very complicated to replace a government. The more likely way for him is to get to a scenario where an election is called. Not that you have a new prime minister appointed, but an election. Now, how can you have an election called? There are 2 scenarios. One, the Knesset votes to disperse itself. Basically, you have a majority in the Knesset that votes to disperse itself voluntarily. This is not a very likely option, and I'll explain why. Almost every party in the Knesset right now, except maybe for the ultra-Orthodox, who have a very stable voting population, every party is afraid to lose seats in an election, including even Likud, by the way. Even Likud in recent polls is not growing and sometimes shrinking by a seat or 2. When all the parties are afraid of losing seats in an election, nobody is going to be very, very quick to push for it. And the second mechanism, which I think is the more likely one, is that the government fails to pass a budget. If a government in Israel fails to pass a budget by a designated date, which for this government I believe is in November, it automatically falls and then an election is initiated. I think Netanyahu's goal as leader of the opposition right now is to create as much disagreement and confusion within this government, and again, attack them from here, ambush them from there, and lead to a loss of trust between the different factions, parties in this government, and bring them to a point where they fail to agree on a budget and everything collapses. I think, are you still with me, Benjamin? Yeah, just for a second. Yeah, so I think this is what he's counting on. At the end of the day, I don't think he believes he can win through a non-confidence vote. I think his main hope is that something, maybe like you said, security event, maybe some other issue, will lead to such levels of distrust within the members of the coalition that they will not pass a budget. And I think he also knows that if a budget is passed, this government could hold on for a long period of time, maybe 2 years or more. So the whole fight right now, if you ask me, is about the budget in November. Will it pass or not?
So let me ask you about another aspect of Netanyahu's leadership and how this may actually end up being an impediment for him going forward. And please feel free to disagree with my premise as well, Amir, of course. But if you look back at recent Netanyahu governments, I would contend that key positions have always been held by individuals who seem competent enough in times of calm, but utterly out of their depth in times of strife or in times of challenge. For example, Health Minister Litzman seemed to be pattering along well enough until COVID-19 struck. Yeah. It then became utterly apparent that he was the wrong man for that ministry during a global pandemic. Minister of Internal Security, Amir seemed a reasonable enough choice until the recent riots in Lod, in Bat Yam, and elsewhere.
He lost control of the situation.
Completely lost control. Gabi Ashkenazi, not from Netanyahu's party, but again, he held the portfolio of foreign minister, a choice that seemed understandable enough on paper, but during our most recent conflict against Hamas, Ashkenazi was basically missing in action.
He seemed a bit absent from that event.
Absolutely, and my view is that in each case, it needed Benjamin Netanyahu to act as the de facto minister for all of the portfolios just mentioned and more, to a degree that made me believe that that dynamic was deliberately pursued by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that he would be the individual who rides in and takes control of these crises.
I'm your savior. This was basically the idea. I'm your savior, and
indispensable leader. Now,
and I have to say, Benjamin, I have to interrupt. One of the things that I think Naftali Bennett is doing different so far, he's trying very much to communicate to the Israeli public that he's complimenting and congratulating his own
absolutely,
which I believe is a welcome
table, right? Yes. Every time there's a session of the cabinet, and to talk that through, and then I want to hear your reaction. I believe that this government has actually, regardless of whether I agree with their politics, which in many cases I do not agree with, but it's inarguable in my view that Naftali Bennett, is heading up a coalition of eminently qualified individuals. Think, for example, of Omer Bar-Lev. This is the former commander of the IDF Sayeret Matkal elite unit. He's now the Minister of Interior Security. Benny Gantz is defense minister. Horowitz seems to be doing well as health minister, despite the challenge. And of course, Yair Lapid, Amir, could be an incredibly effective foreign minister, incredibly effective. I mentioned I don't agree necessarily with their politics, each and every one of them, but this looks like a coalition of the talents. So my question to you is this: does the Israeli voter want a coalition comprised of just one man, that one man being Bibi Netanyahu? Has it not now been exposed as a less than ideal way of governing in Israel?
Okay, so first of all, Benjamin, I do want to say I think there was a freeze for a second, so I'll put it again. Yeah. I'm going to be more cautious in grading the new ministers because it's only been a month and 2 weeks or something. So let's see how they do. There's still time for them to make mistakes and disappoint us. I do want to say about Bennett that he seems to believe what you're saying, that the way to succeed as prime minister in this very weird coalition is to have capable people that he can appreciate and to show that appreciation. I want to give one example just from yesterday. Matan Kahana, who is from Bennett's party, he's the Minister of Religious Affairs. He announced a reform in the kashrut sector in Israel, basically saying he's going to take the power of granting kosher certificates and not take it away from the rabbinate, but make it more transparent and allow other players who will have rabbinical orthodox, not reformer conservative, but orthodox backing, to also become active players in this market. This is a big reform that many Israelis have been striving for years, because there is a sense that the rabbinate is very extreme. It's not a modern Orthodox, it's ultra-Orthodox. And within the ultra-Orthodox, it sometimes adopts the most extreme positions as well. And there is a sense of corruption and, all kinds of deals that the public does not understand in that issue. And so he initiated this reform. And Naftali Bennett came out and said, I congratulate my minister for religious affairs for his important reform. This is a great achievement. I believe that under Netanyahu, a lot of times what would happen is ministers who were talented, and Netanyahu did have talented ministers over the years serve under him. When they would initiate some kind of successful reform, he would try to take the credit to himself. And this frustrated a lot of the people who served under him and caused some kind of an exodus of talent from Likud, of people who, like Gideon Saar, for example, who decided, they can't do this. So I think this is a smart thing for Bennett. With regards to Yair Lapid, Benjamin, I want to say something really interesting. This week was the annual summit of Christians United for Israel. It was a smaller event than most years. I think it was held in Dallas, Texas.
Yes.
And the most senior Israeli speaker was Yair Lapid. In past years, it was always Netanyahu who spoke as the prime minister. And Lapid gave them a 5-minute recorded speech. And he said something which I really appreciated. He said, this was literally the first sentence of his video address, Benjamin. He said, Israel has a new government, but it's the same country. And I thought this was a very smart message to bring specifically to the evangelical pro-Israeli crowd that was very supportive and even more than supportive of Netanyahu over the years. I think Netanyahu is admired within that group, second maybe only to Donald Trump in the feelings that he elicits among that crowd. And for Lapid to come with that message and basically not to come and say, to bash the old government, to declare all kinds of revolutions, things that he does to an internal crowd in Israel on other issues, but to come and say there is some sense of continuity. It's the same country that you love. It's the same country you support and stand by, and we thank you for it. I thought that showed that he's learning how to speak to different audiences and adapting to this role. Now, again, it's very early to grade whether he's a good foreign minister or not. Let's give him a few months to embarrass himself, embarrass us, fail, and give us, the journalists, good stuff to write. But this specifically, I thought, was an interesting moment. And, there is a learning curve there.
Yeah, I agree. There's plenty of time for them to fail. But I also stand by my viewpoint, as much as I take your input here. I do stand by my viewpoint that on paper, these ministers are eminently qualified. They do have the goods. Whether they can deploy those goods effectively or not, that of course remains.
Yes, I do believe that in many of the ministries, listen, even if you look, for example, at Gideon Saar as the justice minister, because basically the justice ministry, what happened is that it was under Amir who came with a very confrontational approach against the legal system related to Netanyahu's trials. Then it went to Benny Gantz's party, and you had Avi Nissenkorn, who basically adopted completely the line of the judicial and the system and the prosecution. And I think between those two extremes, neither is good for Israel. I don't want a justice minister who comes to have a war with the justice system. And I also don't want a justice minister who completely adopts the worldview of the judicial elite. And right now with Gideon Saar, it's an interesting situation. You have a right-wing, former Likud justice minister, who does want to initiate some reforms, who does want to change some of the bad things that are happening within the legal system, but he's not coming with with like a demolition motive. He's coming to do this more as a surgeon, and he knows the system very well because he used to be the government secretary, what we call the cabinet secretary. This is the person who has to coordinate all of the legal work of the government. And he used to work as a prosecutor when he was a young man in the 1990s. And so he brings to this, I think, a more balanced approach. So that's just one example of what you are saying about having more competent ministers.
So 2 more questions for you, Amir, and then I'd like to finish with a brief statement. Tell us, this is, again, the subject at hand today is, will Bibi Netanyahu be back, essentially?
You want me to make a prediction?
In a moment. That's my second question. My first question is this. What's the degree of opposition hailing from within the Likud party? You spoke about a lot of people being trampled upon in the past who are now in government. You also spoke about people to whom Netanyahu was incapable of doling out the credit. How much opposition comes from within his own party, and will he be able, as he has done in the past, to eviscerate that competition?
I think within Likud, Netanyahu is still in a strong position. And I think it will remain that way until the passing or not passing of the budget. The situation right now is that Netanyahu is selling his supporters and also his haters within the party, which is basically all the other politicians who are dying to replace him. He's selling them this story that this government is unstable, made of parties that do not agree with one another on fundamental issues, and that it's a matter of months until it will collapse and a new election will be initiated, and he believes he will win that election. I'm a bit skeptical because, Benjamin, it's terrible to have 4 elections in 2 years. There's almost nothing good about it for any country. The one maybe good thing is that you can learn a bit about the electorate. And these 4 elections in the 2 years, we went through crazy drama. We had COVID emerge, and then the vaccines arrive. We had an economic crisis. We had several wars with Hamas. We had the Abraham Accords, and we had the changing of the administration in America, a lot of drama. It almost didn't move the needle. The elections were very stable. Yeah, Likud emerged with more seats in one election, blue and white in the other. The Arab parties went up or down, but overall it was a very stable situation. And so I don't know what is needed in order to really move the public either way. But he's selling this story to inside his party. And he says, you have to stick by me. Because if now we will go into an internal fight over leadership of Likud, it will benefit the government. We have to stay together, united, get rid of this government, probably around the fall with the budget, and then, new election. I think if the budget will pass and there will be a sense that this government is holding on, this is when the knives will come out in Likud, not beforehand. Right now, he still has strong control of the party itself.
And, my boxing coach used to say to me that predictions are for the weathermen, let them get it wrong. But I am going to ask you, what's your prediction? Will we see him back as PM? And if so, along what timeline?
I think I would give it maybe 20%, 25%, not rule it out completely, but not give it a majority chance either. And I think a lot will rest again on the question of the budget. I think if the budget will not pass, he will have an opening, because his argument will be, you try to replace me, didn't work. Let's, let me come back. Although again, the Israeli public has been very stable in its public opinion in the last 2 years. But still, a failure of this government definitely will help him. If the budget will pass, I don't see a way back for him, because then the government will be perceived as stable. They will have more of an uprising in Likud. And I think at that point, he might have to consider stepping aside and focusing more on his legal issues and the trial. And all of that.
So, Amir, I want to thank you so very much. Before we go, I just want to make a statement for the people who watch this either live or in postcast. And I don't say any of this in any way, shape, or form to cause you any embarrassment whatsoever. I just want to express this for our listeners. You're an individual who really does embody what we're trying to do here at the MirYam Institute. MirYam spells also Mem Resh Yud Mem, Merim, which means elevation or elevating. And we try to elevate the conversation about Israel. There are too many people who try to simplify it, who try to say that a right-wing Israeli is a fanatic, a left-wing Israeli is a traitor. In the diaspora, they say that. Now, I just want to speak out that you're an individual who is someone who was living in, first of all, you served as an officer in 8200. You don't have to take on the extra time to serve as an officer. You did so of your own volition in service to your country. You then were living a wonderful life in Tel Aviv. You saw the rockets raining down in the area surrounding the Gaza Strip, and you and your then girlfriend, now wife, Miri, decided to relocate from Tel Aviv down to Nahal Oz, which absolutely does border the Gaza Strip. It's no exaggeration to say that, in an act of defiance and expressing resolutely that Israeli citizens will not be driven from their homes in the wake of terror or by terror attacks. You're now raising your family there, having returned there after moving to the United States of America. And I dare say, I don't know it, we've never discussed it, but I'm sure had the options, you will have had the option to remain in the United States of America through the contacts and connections, and you chose to go home. That's me guessing, but I think it's a reliable guess. You're a great servant of the state and the people of Israel. You really do embody what we're trying to do here at the MirYam Institute, which is to show the nuance and the dedication and the disparate views that can coalesce around a common cause, that being the state of Israel. And I thank you for educating us again today. I love our conversation. I hope to do it in person with you, hopefully as early as next month. I'm scheduled to finally be back home.
All right.
And my
good news.
Absolutely. And my thanks to you. And of course, I want to thank Rosita Panini, co-founder of the Institute, and Alan Langer, and all of our listeners. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. I know I have. And Amir, thank you for continuing my education.
Thank you, Benjamin. It was a pleasure as always. And when you are back in Israel, you know where to find us in Nahal Oz. We are expecting you.
I look forward to it.
Thank you to Rosita and Alan and to all of our viewers.
All the very best. Bye-bye.
All right, we'll be in touch. להתראות.